to talk about practical ESG solutions, insights from Malaysia's national carrier. Let us welcome the Group Chief Sustainability Officer of Malaysia Aviation Group, MAG, who is also a presenter at BFM Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Philip C.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? It's very interesting to do a talk before your lunch. What stands between a sumptuous cuisine on a Saturday afternoon is a 30-minute lecture on sustainability from an aviation context. So I'll try not to keep it too boring. I have 30 minutes with you. And my goal really is to try and give you a sense of the challenges, the work done so far, and really the amount of work we still need to do in the coming years ahead. And we will go through that journey in this next 30 minutes. Before I kind of go through the materials, a bit about myself. I'm definitely not a known sustainability practitioner. I did a degree in chemical engineering, so maybe there's some use of it now, but throughout my whole career has been management consultant. I used to run Firefly. I used to be the CEO of Firefly throughout the pandemic, and then I was brought back to the group, and they decided, oh, okay, you're quite free now. Why don't you manage this, one of the three core businesses of the group, which is the loyalty and travel services business. So I manage Enrich, I manage the e-commerce functions of the group, but they said, oh, but you're paid so much, so you need to do more work. Hence why they also gave me the role of also managing sustainability. I would say, very humbly, I am definitely not the most well-versed in terms of in the areas of sustainability, but I do stand here with a very strong team of 8 people in the sustainability team that work very hard actually to really embed these practices throughout the organization. So 3 agenda today. I just want to give you a bit of context about the industry. It's actually a pretty hard sector to obey. I'll also give you a sense about what our journey has been so far and what really is the work needed, right, for us to hit our net zero commitments. The industry is a global industry. So when you actually look at Malaysia Airlines, and if you actually look at the airport, basically our operations transcends the boundaries of the country we are based in, which is Malaysia. And so for us, right, like the maritime industry, actually we are governed a lot by cross-border regulations and industries that have deep impact on the business. And it is sometimes very hard to attribute the emissions or the impact we have down to a specific jurisdiction, simply because our operations is very much global in nature. If you go to the airport at night, right, midnight, you will see flights departing to Japan, Australia, Europe now, Paris, London, and around the world. And we also build deep partnerships with multiple airlines that connect us to about 1,200 destinations. And so truly, this industry we operate in Malaysia Aviation Group is an incredibly global industry. And so when we think about the impact we have on not only our country, but on the global scale, we really also watch very carefully the legally binding commitments in the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but very much so, actually, in the airline industry, there are already binding regulations in place that we as participating nations actually have to already comply with. For instance, CORSIA, which is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or even the commitments by ICAO through CAAF3, these already are in impact. So this is not something that we in the industry think will take place in 5 years, 10, 15 years. We are already, as an industry, dealing with the implications of how climate change and sustainability affects fundamentally our operations as a business. To add another texture to this as well, Malaysia has made some progress, right, with respect to how it should start embarking on its sustainability journey. You've heard of the NETR, and even within the National Energy Transition Roadmap, there are some commitments already on how do we start having a sustainable aviation fuel on our flights, right? 1% by 2027, 47% by 2050. And even the Ministry of Transport has even developed a Malaysia aviation decarbonization blueprint. But what I want to stress here is that when you look at all these roadmaps and goals, some of it is binding, some of it is not. But what we take very seriously is the commitments made and how do we actually contribute as being a national carrier across the board. I do want to say actually that we in the industry, a lot of pressure actually comes from a global side. So for example, for Malaysia Airlines, we are part of the One World Alliance. And actually the One World Alliance, which includes airlines like British Airways, Cathay Pacific, Japan Airlines, American Airlines, we actually made clear commitments actually to start having 5% of our fuel being sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. No, I correct myself, it's 10%, right? And so this is what actually happens when you're part of a global community and global industry. Actually, the industry propels you forward, whether or not you're ready to execute many of these commitments that we do. And so because of that, we've had to be sometimes been ahead of the curve that many of our local partners based here in Malaysia are, because naturally, we are a global industry. So let me give you a sense about, before we talk about the numbers and about the operational goals and commitments we've made, I do want to take a step back and talk to you about how we think about it. Our goal is to really commit to drive sustainable practices in the organization. I will tell you that 3-4 years ago, we made really, really lofty goals. Like we were going to be like #1 in Asia Pacific and all that. And we realized that all these platitudes are actually pointless. And so we moved away from the target and to the end state to actually spending time in focusing on the how side, which is how do we get actually everybody on this journey, right, towards actually driving for some level of sustainable practice across the different parts of our business. And so ultimately the goal is to promote socio-economic development and preserve the environment, because as part of the aviation industry, there has been a collective commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. Now, underpinning this are 5 core United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, we cannot take everything, and for us, we decided to focus on 5. The first is number 5, gender equality. The second is affordable and clean energy. Number 3, responsible consumption and production. Number 4, climate action. Number 5, partnerships for the goals. You know, there was a very interesting point made just now about physical risk. And the reason why, when my boss asked me to take on this work, was fundamentally to actually convince the organization that this is a really serious effort, is that it really has a big implication on your business and operations. So I remember having this conversation 3-4 years ago when KLIA began to close off because of flooding, excessive flooding, right? So access to actually to the airport was restricted. And so I had a friend of mine who was from MIT, and she did modeling for me, and she actually said, look, if we don't take action, in 10, 15, 20 years, the probability of the airport or one of the 2 runways getting flooded will increase by about 30-40% in 20 years. If you talk to our pilots, they will tell you how climate change has affected their operating theater, how actually increasing temperatures has affected how wind movements have effectively reduced our efficiency as an operation. If you talk to our engineers on the ground, they will tell you how the increased amount of soot and pollution actually on the air has affected the maintenance of our engines across the board. So fundamentally, if you want to win the hearts of the organization, it must fundamentally affect the operations for them to really feel the tangible effects so that you can propel truly lasting change in the organization. But for us, as I say just now, when I gave you those examples, they're very much the E component of ESG, right? The whole point about emissions reduction. Of course, we have elements of waste, climate adaptation, which I'll talk a bit about later. But as a national carrier, actually, there are a lot of elements that are social and governance in related. For example, diversity is such an important part of our commitment in sustainability. I mean, we are a global airline, so we connect passengers around the world. So the makeup and composition of our customer is global in nature. It's diverse in nature. And so our employee workforce also has to reflect what our customer composition is. Because we are a global business where we basically transcend barriers, there is a huge amount of human trafficking and wildlife trafficking that comes through our airports. And so we also have a responsibility to make sure that that is also managed in a very thoughtful way as well. So I do want to stress in this slide that for us, when we think about sustainability, it is not purely about climate action alone, but it is a whole gamut of many issues that we as a group need to think about for the long-term sustainable outcome of the business. I am very clear, as one of the leads, is the reason why my boss made me manage this is fundamentally sustainability of this organization has to be linked to the financial sustainability of the business. You cannot look at it separately. And so because of that, when you see the coming slides, a lot of our work is anchored on data, and my best friend actually is the CFO, right? And so that is a really important lesson that we've learned in how we want to make a tangible impact in the business, and why it's so important that someone actually who understands this a bit actually sits on the group exco or the board or management to make sure that issues raised across the business and operations also enable us to have a sustainability lens to it across the board. Let me give you a bit of sense. I'm sure just now you had a bit of a feedback about how how we measure emissions, but maybe just specifically for the airline. If you break down into scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, most of our emissions is actually scope 1, which is actually the fuel that's burned on the flight going from Kuala Lumpur to all the destinations we take. That usually accounts for 80 to 85% of our emissions. And then that comes with scope 2, which is only about 4 to 5%. And that really is the energy generated at our hangars, our cargo facility, at the airport, our ground vehicles. So that is actually part of scope 2. And scope 3 is where it gets very complicated for the airline industry, simply because when you think about the value chain of the aviation industry, it is truly global. Think about the engines that come from our aircraft. Think about the maintenance parts. So trying to trace the value chain of that is incredibly challenging and complex. And so when we started putting and anchoring our data, we first fixed scope 1 and scope 2. We had some provisional numbers on scope 3, but far from accurate. And throughout the whole process, we actually worked very closely with our IATA international body, as well as partner airlines, to actually put in place the right standards to make sure that we slowly build more accuracy in our scope 3. But let me just say, for us in the aviation industry, if I compare and contrast, let's say us and let's say the oil and gas industry, for us, the huge source of our emissions is scope 1, and then for them, like Petronas, it's scope 3. So it's a bit of a flip side. But the biggest issue then is then focusing on how we can think and target our scope 1 while still not ignore our scope 3. So let me just deep dive on scope 1 a bit. Now, in the aviation and airline industries, to help us reduce emissions, there are 4 very important levers. If you can see by this chart here, firstly, you have sustainable aviation fuel. That basically means how do you replace your carbon-based fuel that we pump on board your aircraft to actually other sources of feedstocks and fuels that are not carbon-based, right? For example, we have used cooking oil here in Malaysia, hydrogen, as sources of sustainable aviation fuel. That accounts for usually 2/3 of the pathway towards decarbonizing. The next one is new technologies, which really is, if you recently followed the news in Malaysia Airlines, the investment in new aircraft that we have, right, with better engine technologies, better aerodynamics that help you actually reduce the emissions through better technology. And naturally, operations and infrastructure, which is how do we make sure we optimize our operations across the board. And I'll explain that a bit more later. If you even add these 3 parts, which is what we call is in-sector, this only contributes to 80% of our pathway towards decarbonization as a business. And what the team has done is we've actually modeled what are the efforts needed for us to fundamentally hit net zero by 2050. And as you can see from the chart here, the new fleet efforts, op efficiency, SAF, and offset require all four to work hand in hand. Let me just explain a bit this chart. If you see the red dotted line, I don't know whether you can see that. This is an industry that's growing. Yeah, it's a growing business, if you notice, especially here in this part of Asia Pacific. And so if you see the red line, there's a huge dip, right, during the pandemic across the board. And slowly it's been rising back up again. And where we are now at is that actually our flying is nearly close to where we were at pre-pandemic levels already. You can see in the airports, we are full. Our flights are full, and actually everybody is investing and growing. And so basically, if we do nothing at all, our emissions will keep rising. And that is why it's so important to invest in new fleet, to have actually built in-house operational efficiency, even just to keep to the same emissions level as what we did in 2019. And that is an extremely tall order. And so the team has been modeling all the different permutations and what is the right levers we need to activate at what level for us to hit this number. And this is an incredibly challenging work we are exploring and doing now. So let me give you a bit of sense of some sample initiatives that we are doing, right, to help us hit to net zero. So on operational efficiency, if you actually go to the airport and you see our planes, you will notice sometimes these little trucks at the bottom, which are electrified, where actually we use to actually power our aircraft on the ground so that we're not using actually carbon fuel. Or even, if you see on this chart here, the motor torque, which is what is being used to now move the aircraft as it exits out from the gate as told out, right? And that's electronically managed as well. A new technology, as you know, we are replacing our narrow bodies with the 737 MAX 8-8s, and actually even our wide bodies, we are replacing the A330ceos with the 330neos, and those actually reduce emissions by approximately 14 to 15%. The third and most important lever is sustainable aviation fuel. And so we have been running a whole series of trials and experiments actually for the past 2 years. And we have experimented in all our aircraft types. We've experimented across all our business unit groups. And we have also an agreement with Petronas actually to start actually pumping SAF into our fleet on a structural basis from 2028 onwards. And so this is an incredibly important lever, but also a very incredibly expensive lever for us to execute across the board. Our guiding philosophy is we must make as much of our best efforts on the in-sector work, right? Which is how do you drive greater operational efficiency, invest in new aircraft, and actually move towards biofuels. Because when you start, and when all these options are exhausted, then we move towards using carbon offsets. But we've even played and offered this even for our passengers. If you actually go and book on MalaysiaAirlines.com now, you can actually choose to offset your travel if you choose to, right? But that doesn't even account yet for even our emissions, but it's more an opportunity for you to choose to offset your own travel. And so really there is a whole gamut of initiatives and efforts that we have to do towards even meeting that specific goal. So this is an example of just what we talked about, operational efficiency. You know, I talked to our pilots, and for them and for the business, operational efficiency always makes a lot of effort, makes a lot of sense, because you're actually reducing the fuel consumption on board for that flight. Let's say from KL to Singapore, you need to burn 1,000 tons. But what we're saying, if you actually put these little levers in place, improving your engine out taxi in, adjust your flap landing, you know, how you put in extra fuel, or how do you kind of cruise on the cruising level of the aircraft. All these little initiatives actually lead towards some savings. And if you look on this chart, it's actually quite humbling, because if you put in all this incredible effort, and it gives you 2% savings as a business, right? And so many people can feel very, I would say, deflated by this number. But for us as a business where airline margins are 1%, 2%, every small savings counts a lot. And for them now, they have the added impetus of doing this, because it not only helps you improve the business proposition, because you actually reduce the fuel consumption on board, you actually also reduce the emissions that we also drive towards. But the work is incredible, and it is painstaking and painful to do. It requires you to talk to pilots, and you have to convince pilots and have sessions with them to say, we've got to get this done, and not everybody buys into this whole process. And so this engagement is challenging, but very fruitful and incredibly rewarding if you put in the effort to do that. So even when you do this work, there has to be a roadmap. And just now, if you saw just now, we actually have built a financial model and a roadmap all the way up to 2050, right? In terms of what are the key levers we need to do towards decarbonizing. And so the team has put a lot of effort to say, look, 2050 is just too way out there, because that's a long way. So we have internally built even a midterm 2030 roadmap where there are clear actions and clear efforts needed to be taken on just one of the levers, and that means we have to do it for all the other levers to help us actually hit our numbers. And so we even have internal 2030, 2028 goals, 2040 goals to drive forward. So just to give you a sense, my group CEO has a scorecard to make sure he has to bring down his absolute emission intensity by X%. I can't tell you what the number is, but we have internal goals that actually leadership has to drive, which is part of their corporate scorecard. Again, as I mentioned, a huge chunk of the business is modernizing our fleet and actually putting more fuel-efficient aircraft. As you know, for Malaysia Aviation Group, it has been a very challenging past few decades for us, right? MH17, MH370. We also had the COVID crisis, but we actually took the opportunity to reset all our contracts. And actually, we are now on much stable footing. That's why actually we've built our businesses, and that's why we have MABA actually as part of the whole strategy to diversify the business going forward. But the whole function of making the tough decision to restructure the business is now we have the capital to reinvest in the business. And so in the coming years and months ahead, we are introducing a lot of very efficient technology that will also not only improve and reduce our emissions, it will also elevate the customer experience. So I hope, one day I will hope to see you all on a A330neo flight to Melbourne, Auckland, or Bali, where you will actually really see how we've tried very hard to improve the customer experience of our passengers, while at the same time also meet the dual goal of actually reducing our emissions as a whole. Now, this is the most challenging topic in the aviation industry. If you saw in the earlier chart, 2/3 of our pathway to decarbonization will involve actually pumping in sustainable aviation fuel. The big challenge here is that it currently is 3 to 4 times the price of what conventional fuel is at the moment. And so everybody across the world is trying to grapple and think about ways to get that going. Right? And this is a chart that illustrates how challenging it is and how every country actually is trying different ways to actually move that. We already are beginning to have sustainable aviation fuels on our flights from Paris to London, right? Because there's already a mandate kicking in this year in 2025, 2% for our Paris flights and our cargo flights from Amsterdam, 2% also from the United Kingdom. In closer home to Asia, India already will be implementing that in 2027, Japan by 2030, and the likes, right? And so because it's a global airline, all this actually is already affecting the business, and we already are beginning to experience the impacts of sustainable aviation fuel in our business. To give you an example, because of that price, the commitment of 2% SAF, our fuel bills, ex-UK and Europe, have increased by 7% because of how expensive it is. Now think about the fact that our airline margins are 2 to 3%. How even those changes have big implications on your business. And so I urge all of you, right, when you see these issues, how do you plan ahead? How do you secure the right contracts? How do you think about deploying the most fuel-efficient aircraft on those routes, right? It's really important because sustainability has really big implications on your business. And I can attest to you, for us as an organization here, it has already begun to feel its effects to us. And so a lot of effort is being put to see how we can manage that, reduce the cost, and inevitably even have a conversation about how we need to even recover that cost through fuel surcharges and such to the passengers. And so those are really tough decisions that require us to think not only as a sustainable team, but to think holistically as a group. And that's why it was very important for people like myself to sit at the Group Exco, because these things have huge repercussions to the overall business as we have. So in the end also, we also have commitments in the global body, as I said, through CORSIA, right? Where actually there's already a commitment to actually reduce our emissions from 2024 onwards to be even 85% of 2019 emissions levels. And this is a very complicated global system because not everybody participates, some do, some don't. And so we've had to actually monitor our emissions at a granular level to really understand how much we need to recover the cost of our emissions reductions, and even whether or not sustainable aviation fuels even can contribute to this reduction in emissions. So in short, there is a lot of technical challenge here, and I think it requires investment in time, effort, and really thoughtful planning that really looks at all the different levers of decarbonization in a very interrelated way for you to find the best solution for business. And so this is really a huge challenge for the team, and we spend and invest a lot of time to find the most efficient way for us to actually reduce emissions. And if we can't get it done in sector, we will have to do out of sector and actually secure right certified offsets, which is actually, even as we speak now, very limited, because for us in the aviation industry, we follow different standards from what are agreed standards even in Malaysia as a whole. I want to explain a bit, but just to give you a sense of the scheme we operate in, it operates in phases, from a pilot phase that was done in the past 3 years, and actually already we are beginning to feel the effects in the first phase and second phase, where it will become mandatory and it will expand across all our markets as a whole. So again, right, you cannot run away from data. If you really want to make this meaningful and work, you must go down to the granularity. And so even just to give you an example here, we have already mapped out at a route level what our CO2 emissions are at a flight level, what is our exposure at that level, and actually forcing us to think about where we deploy the right asset, where do we need to source our SAF in a more strategic manner at the different markets we operate in. So for example, when I fly from Kuala Lumpur to Paris or Kuala Lumpur to Melbourne, I actually have to buy SAF not only from Kuala Lumpur, which is Petronas, but from also all the other destinations across the board. So we have to build a deep relationship with our fuel procurement team to actually start sourcing SAF not only in Malaysia, but in Europe, in Australia, in Japan, throughout our global network as a whole. And then we have to decide, when I look at our exposure from an emission standpoint, what are the right levers I need to execute at that granular level so that I can help us manage the cost structure for the business. And so this works. I encourage you, really put the best brains to do this, because this is not easy work. This requires you to balance the short term, the mid-term, and the long term. And it requires people who really know the business very well. You can't have functional experts to run this work, because if you want to win the hearts of the organization to make these changes, they need to know the business extremely well. And perhaps that's why the boss asked me to do this work, because I know how to navigate the internal organization of how we move forward to get this going right. And I will be honest with you, my sustainability team, half of them, we make an effort to make sure they are actually from the aviation industry. So there's no BS, right? There's no motherhood statements. All have to be anchored on very clear, tangible action items. And you want to win them to execute, it's so important. So I already talked a bit about emissions, but when I talk about the airline industry, waste is also a huge, incredibly difficult problem. Think about in-flight waste on board the aircraft. How are you going to separate waste when you're operating in a tube, right, from KL to London? And how are you going to do that when the cabin crew only have 35 minutes to serve you the food from KL to Singapore? So think about the operational constraints and the deep empathy you need to have to really win the hearts of cabin crew operations to actually make some of these really important changes in the business, right? And how do you even think strategically to actually try and reduce the amount of waste before you start needing to separate it across the board? And so all I would say is I'm very blessed that we have people who are very passionate about this, because we are a global industry, right? And so our cabin crew are also very passionate about this because they talk to our customers and our customers care about this stuff. And so how do you win them bit by bit to start thinking about putting in place the right strategies to help reduce the in-flight waste on board? And then think about ground waste, right, which is our cargo, our ground handling. All that actually is very important. And for our maintenance engineering team, the schedule waste, all those chemicals, right? And so you have to unpack and understand the different components of waste, go into deep granularity and trace the source and actually find out how it's being used, consumed, and then find ways to build the right interventions across the board. And a lot of it is also changing the behavior of your organization. So for us, the team really was trying to, how do you convince engineers in their cafeteria to bring their own cutlery? It's the last thing on their mind, right? So how do you get that shift right? It's also very important. As I said just now, we've talked a bit about the environmental side. The social part is very important for MAG. I mean, when we think about the business, we have made tremendous progress on women representation, 37%. If you look at our managers and above, it's at 44%. But we have incredible amount of work needed to do, especially on two areas, which is actually on the pilots and actually on our licensed aircraft engineer, which is only about 7% of our population actually being female. And we know that actually if you bring a more diverse workforce, you actually get better ideas, you actually break down the power distance of the organization, and you can actually deliver better outcomes from an operational efficiency standpoint as a whole. So my colleague here, Ilani, spends a lot of time here trying to go through the entire recruitment process of our engineer to try and remove any bias, right, that you might see when it comes to actually bias towards male engineers as a whole. So this is incredibly bone-breaking effort because you have to look and observe every single iota of process to make sure that there's no bias to this. And this is not easy work, right? Because you have a leadership that's all male, and you want to tell them to bring in more females. It's hard. How do you get them to change that perception, right? Requires people to be very reflective and drive that outcome across the board. So I'll give you an example. Just last year, we inducted our first batch of Orang Asli as cabin crew. Wonderful, but how do you convince the village that it's a great career to have since they've only lived in that village their whole life? And so building a mentorship program, journeying with this cohort of 8 Orang Asli to make sure that they're successful is a lot of effort and requires a lot of investment across the board. I mean, there are a lot of initiatives that we do, right? Using our waste of our uniforms to upcycle and all that. It doesn't move the needle, but I think it's a way to tell the organization we have to move forward and every little effort counts. Even though it doesn't contribute much to the end state, but if it energizes the 13,000 of us to think that we can make a difference, it will help. Time check, am I okay? No, not okay. Okay. And so really, governance side, so much work being done here, especially something for me I'm very passionate about is human trafficking and wildlife trafficking. I mean, we are really a trading nation, and so movement of cargo and shipment across the board is so clear, and actually training your crew, training your staff to observe suspicious behavior, even when you see on board our aircraft, whether or not there are slaves on board your flights actually, are really important things that you have to develop and train your cabin crew to be fully aware of, right? And so we work with a lot of NGOs to help us do capacity building for a lot of our frontliners, because they are the first point of contact, right, for all these different issues that are taking place globally across the organization. So, just now it was mentioned about reporting and disclosure. We are not listed by any way, but as you know from the timeline, we will soon be needing to report and disclose to IASB standards by 2028. But we, as part of Khazanah, have always tried to be ahead and actually start building the infrastructure to collect data and actually work to audit our data as well through external verifiers, especially to our overseas emissions across the board. And so I do want to conclude by saying, in the end, when you saw the earlier goal, which was to drive sustainable practices, it doesn't feel sexy, but really for us as a team, when we think about sustainability, it's also about the sustainability of the business in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years' time. And to do that requires us to win the hearts of our organization, the 13,000 people in Malaysia Aviation Group. So I think the bulk of our effort is how do you win them over? How do you get them to think not about themselves, but about the work they do that has an impact not only on the customer, not only on the people they work with, not only on the incomes they generate for their family, but also for broader societal benefits. And so the whole crux of what we do here is how do we create 13,000 people who are just able to be reflective and inward, but actually use that energy to make a difference beyond just that small group of who they talk to every day, but know that the work they do actually has deep implications for not only themselves, but for the country and for the broader global environment. So on that note, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.